As a child, I experienced sorrow and loss early. When I was 5, just before Christmas, my father died in hospital of burns received as the result of an explosion in the engine room. It took 5 days for the ship to limp into Horta in the Azores for repairs and to put my delirious father ashore. My father died there, alone, and we were swiftly reduced from comfort to poverty and the need to keep up appearances. Our private education was continued by my father's shipping company, but there was no help with uniforms, so I became shabby, and some nuns were very unkind to shabby children. I did receive a thorough grounding in my religion, and perhaps because of my feeling of exclusion, I drank in the words of Christ at a relatively early age. Of course, I prayed that my father's death so far away might have been misreported, that he might come back to us. But when he didn't, I didn't lose faith in God. By the age of 10, my favourite words of Christ were, "Come to me, all ye who labour and are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest." I first became aware of Jews outside the references in the Gospel one Saturday as I walked up the busy main road with my mother to do the shopping. Coming towards us was a very formal group of people. Well, they looked slightly different and obviously not going out to do the shopping. "Why are those people wearing Sunday clothes on a Saturday?" I asked my mother. She replied, "They are Jews and they go to church on a Saturday," and added, "They are very good to their old people." So despite the references to the perfidious Jews in the Good Friday liturgy and the dreadful blood libel story of St. Hugh of Lincoln in 6 O'Clock Saints, my image of Jews was positive. Of course, we had contact with a Jew when my mother went to the pawn shop to pawn her ring. The pawnbroker was a lovely man, accommodating and holding onto the ring long past the agreed date, until my mother had the money to redeem it. We also borrowed money to buy clothes with cheques to be spent in certain designated shops. And the man who sold us the cheques was also Jewish. He collected our payments regularly, weekly, and provided a real service without which we could not have bought our winter clothing. Although we did get some very nice hand-me-downs from more prosperous relatives. I didn't ever hear negative comments about Jews at home, or from my relatives or friends, but only from the pulpit. However, Hugh of Lincoln had left an impression, because as I walked to school through the Bullring tenements, I thought that I was passing through a ghetto. It was, in fact, I believe, a stronghold of the Orange Lodge. One evening, I might have been about 14, I was alone in the house, watching black and white television, when a programme came on about the Holocaust, which had only ended 9 years earlier. I had never heard or read about the Holocaust before, and when my mother came in, I was tear-stained and shocked. Had that really happened? My mother said that it had, but that she had found it too dreadful to think about, let alone talk about. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it because the Jews, as I then thought, had killed Christ? Was it because they had said, "His blood be upon us and upon our children"? Whatever the cause, the horror of what I saw remained with me. When my mother and I went to visit my brother and his family in his army base in Bergen-Belsen, we visited the memorial to those murdered by the Nazis. I cannot remember whether this was before or after watching the programme about the death camps. I think it was before, because I didn't feel the full dreadful meaning hidden behind the enormous number of people who had died. I did experience the eerie silence, the absence of birdsong, the sense of desolation. After this visit, I was occupied by O-levels. I didn't do much work for them and was allowed to give up subjects that I didn't like, without any consultation between the school and my mother, who didn't want me to be too academic. Another attitude which had something to do with her hated boarding school. At A-level, I was saved by English literature, the Romantic poets Hamlet and Gerard Manley Hopkins. To these I added St. John of the Cross. And Peggy, whilst enjoying a very happy social life with a group of my peers, male and female, from other local grammar schools. Unknown to me, however, a big change was about to take place in my life. Whilst training to be a teacher, I chose to study divinity and was introduced to the Old Testament in a way that took me beyond those stories that we knew leading up to the Exodus. I relied very little upon exegesis. I sat in libraries and in the light of the Stations of the Cross in the crypt of our cathedral and meditated upon God's promises of eternal love and fidelity for his people, the Jews. And I came to the conclusion that God had not rescinded those promises, that Christ on the cross had not rescinded them. Jews were still, like ourselves, making their way to God, and this conviction was a source of great joy and peace to me. As part of our divinity course, a nun came to talk to us about Judaism. Her name was Sister Louis Gabriel, and she belonged to the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion, a religious order founded by the Ratisbon brothers, French Jews, who, while visiting Rome, had converted to Christianity, or Catholicism, under miraculous circumstances. The original mission of the order was to convert Jews, but after the horrors of the Holocaust, that mission was changed and is now to create understanding between Christians and Jews. After her talk, I went up to Sister Louis Gabriel and said that if I were not a Catholic, I would like to be a Jew. I think I might have said that it would feel valid, but I could, in retrospect, be putting words into my own mouth. Whatever I said, it was the start of my relationship with the Sisters of Sion. I inherited from my grandmother a sepia-toned print of the Madonna of the Tear, in which a young Jewish woman leans over her child's crib and raises the sleeping child's chubby hand to her lips. An almost invisible tear is on her cheek, and an inscription below reads, "And a sword will pierce thy soul." This picture helped me to place Jews in the... This picture helps me to place Jesus in the arms of his young Jewish mother and at the centre of a Jewish family, and to place Mary in the long line of strong Jewish holy women. My first job as a secondary teacher was in Canada. With two friends, I set out at last for adventure and travel. I had intended to go somewhere wild and distant, but eventually we settled for Edmonton, Alberta, where I taught in a junior high school. Even though I was with two good friends and my oldest brother and his family lived in the city, I was desperately lonely. No one could have guessed it. Had they seen me at a party or on our weekly after-school excursions to the beer parlour, my friends and I saw no contradiction either in our visits to the beer parlour and our signing up for Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, which was on permanent exposition in the new cathedral, not far from our apartment. I was producing a play with my junior high students and used to walk past the cathedral on my way home from an evening practicing. The cathedral had that gripping stillness that exposition creates, and I found it profoundly restful and calming just to sit there wordlessly. One evening, words came to me as if from nowhere. I asked God what he wanted of me. The answer didn't come at once, but it did leave me with a sense of exciting anticipation. After a few days, the answer came. I must become a nun, and the order I should join must be the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. I was filled with joy, excitement. But there were those who knew me and couldn't believe it. I was a party animal. I never stopped talking. I was vain. I loved men. I loved to drink. I was a rebel. I was a practical joker. I loved laughing, especially during solemn events. My mother back in England was devastated. After a convent boarding school education, she loathed nuns, and now the nuns had got her only daughter. But join the convent I did, and reborn in the novitiate, I began a new stage of my life. Our order was involved in the drawing up of the Vatican II Declaration on the Jews, which exonerated them from blame for the death of Christ, and ordered the removal of anti-Semitic stories and tropes from Catholic teaching, and made it the duty of priests to explain during the sermon any apparent anti-Semitism existing in the Gospel. As a novice, I took the name of one of my brothers, who had skipped ship to join the French Foreign Legion and still caused my mother much worry. I became Sister Mary Angus, and I asked God to give me the gift of being with Angus, who was 10 years my senior, at his death, if he should die before I did. I remained in the novitiate for 18 months, until, in the same way that I believe I had been called to enter, I was called to leave. It was not an easy decision. I experienced none of the euphoria that I had felt as I entered. I knew that I was going home to a difficult domestic situation. My future would no longer be decided for me. I would be lonely again. In the convent, I had learned the meaning of hard work, the ability to see tasks through, to tolerate other people, to be silent, to be prayerful, and above all, to love the Jews. I remember kneeling in the large chapel at the Mother House, promising God that I would continue to hold his chosen people in my heart. My arrival home delighted my mother, and who could blame her? And I heard the inevitable, "How did you escape?" We knew you'd never stick it. In fact, my departure from the novitiate was painful, but I could not have been shown more loving kindness by the novice mistress, who remained a friend for life. It was difficult to adapt to social life and home life. My best friend had married. I felt out of place. I was quick to find a teaching post. I had trained for secondary, but an infant school in Kirby was in desperate need of a reception teacher for a class of 43 infants. I loved those children and inadvertently did quite a lot of the right things with them. We sang, painted, acted, and I dramatised the marriage feast of Cana, complete with Israeli dancing, resulting in consternation in the staff room. There was further consternation when I sent a note around inviting staff to join a fellow teacher and myself when praying for Israel during the first Arab-Israeli war. The staff were spared any further shocks when, suffering from quite severe hair loss, I was told by the specialist that I was in the wrong job and needed something less stressful. What a calamity. My money was needed at home. The education office came to my rescue, and I was given a maintenance grant so that I could change career. I chose to go to a further education college to do a postgraduate secretarial course, which included study towards a basic language qualification. I chose Spanish. I was a hopeless typist. I found shorthand impossible, but the Spanish was quite a success. I had made a new friend at the college, another refugee from teaching and fellow dunce at typing, and I began to go out as part of a foursome with her boyfriend, and his friend. The evenings were getting much lighter. Spring was in the air, but I was still unsettled. A Benedictine friend had offered to recommend me for a post with his publisher in America. I was considering that, but I decided to go on retreat to the convent in Wales at which that Benedictine was now chaplain. My new secretarial course friend and I set off together on Spy Wednesday and spent our time in silent reflection and prayer and healthy walks along the nearby promenade. I prayed for guidance in my life and for a way to continue my vocation to create understanding between Christians and Jews. My friend and I arrived home from retreat on Easter Saturday, April the 14th, 1968, my mother's birthday. My mother had no desire at all to keep me in the house with her if I had an opportunity to go out with friends. So I was making a foursome again. It was almost time for me to be picked up when there was a knock at the door. Our enormous boxer dog bounded to his feet, and my mother used all her strength to restrain him. I opened the door. There stood two tanned, foreign-looking men, one of whom asked in very broken English for my brother, who was away at sea. It was the time of a very long bus strike. The men had arrived by taxi. We invited them in. How times have changed. The kettle went on. I thought I'd try my Spanish. It worked, and we somehow discovered that my brother's friend in Buenos Aires had asked the younger of the two men, who were Argentine, to come to our house to see if my brother could procure a certain book on deep-sea fishing. I said that I would get the book and gave them my phone number so that we could arrange to meet later that week. At the first opportunity that I had, I went looking for the book on deep-sea fishing, only to find that it had to be ordered. I ordered it. With my friend from the secretarial course, we arranged to meet the men outside Atlantic House, where else, the following Sunday morning after Mass. It was the 22nd of April and bitterly cold, and we were dressed in skirts and blouses. The men wanted to see Chester, so off we went by ferry and Wallasey bus. We spent an interesting afternoon with them. They shook out clean hankies to place on the bench for us to sit on. They roared with laughter when they saw the rowing boats being rowed by women, while the men sprawled lazily in the chilly sunshine. My Argentine behaved impeccably. My friend's Argentine allowed his arm to slip round my friend's shoulders as they sat on the bus. She removed it. We met them several times after that and maintained the polite formality between us. After these utterly chaste dates and a parting kiss on the forehead from David, my Argentine, they sailed. I posted the book to David's home address. He sent me a beautiful postcard, followed by letters, and at our next meeting in August, in Rotterdam, David asked me to marry him, and I agreed. What helped me to decide that this man was for me, apart from the chaste kiss on the forehead, was the fact that his friend had felt it necessary to warn me that David was Jewish. We married in Montevideo Cathedral on October the 9th, 1969, and returned to Liverpool in 1970 for the birth of our first child. David came to Mass with me to help with our 4 children and loved to listen to the gospel, but he was deeply, deeply Jewish and could not leave his mother's faith. He was such a loving and unselfish husband, father, son, son-in-law and friend that he seemed to me to have something of Christ about him. It took time for David to feel quite comfortable to publicly admit that he was Jewish. So bad had been the anti-Semitism he had experienced ever since his childhood, spent under the fascist regime of Juan and Eva Perón. His parents' family in Poland, with the exception of one uncle, who was hidden by a fellow musician, had vanished in the Warsaw Ghetto, or Treblinka, or Majdanek. After a few years of marriage, as well as coming to church with me, David began to go to the synagogue on a Saturday, and I felt very happy for him. When you marry somebody from an ethnic minority group, and Jews are an ethnic minority, you become alert to racism, even unspoken racism, expressed in a glance, a tone, a shift in body language. You certainly react to overt racism. And you hear plenty of it from people who don't know that your husband is Jewish. I always let them finish before enlightening them. I don't any longer hold it against them, as once I did. It's harder when your children are targeted, as 3 of mine, 4 have been. I have phoned a tennis club about anti-Semitic jokes and jibes aimed at a 10-year-old. Our son in the cathedral choir had to put up with and was expected to laugh at anti-Semitic humour from the parent of another choir boy. Another child was racially abused on Allerton Road and in the city centre. I've heard it from the pulpit. The Jews with their usurers' bags, introduced into the lovely story of the woman taken in adultery, and years later the Jews went up to Jerusalem to pray and to do business. I have politely tackled individual priests. One young man, who closely resembled our image of Jesus, gave a sermon that seemed as if the Vatican II had never taken place. When I reminded him of the fact that many years had passed since Jews had been accused of the death of Christ, he looked loftily over my head as he waved to parishioners leaving Mass and said, "Oh, I'm afraid that there is some racial guilt." Now, Archbishop Warlock was a man who took Vatican II very seriously, and when my husband was having his second heart surgery, phoned our home to see how he was and to send his reassurance that he was praying. My husband loved him, and other priests too, who were, like Archbishop Warlock, devoid of that dangerous ancient prejudice. I have heard anti-Semitism from neighbours, lovely church-going neighbours, who told me that such and such a person living nearby was a Jew. Like my late husband, I replied. They assured me that they'd not meant any harm. They really liked Jews. Some people think that I have a bee in my bonnet about the Jews. I haven't. To quote Psalm 15, God has put into my heart a wonderful love for the righteous people who live in his land. And by the way, God did answer my prayer, and I was able to be with Angus when he died.